Hello, friends. Welcome to Peace and Power Ukraine, a place to discuss all aspects of policy related to Ukraine. As you know, Ukraine sits at the crossroads of modern history, where East meets West and freedom collides with totalitarianism. Thank you for joining us today as we dig deeply with guests from across the public policy spectrum. We want to bring more light than heat. And today we are going to do that with my friend Saul Anuzis of the International Institute. He is president there. It's a project of the 60 Plus Foundation. Welcome, Saul.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
Yeah, why don't we start off today by hitting some headlines. As you know, President Putin in Russia suffered what many are calling his personal Pearl Harbor, a surprise attack, but the Ukrainian intelligence apparatus that really gutted his strategic bomber fleet. And that really impacts his ability to deliver long-range ballistic missiles at Ukraine, which he's been using to attack its cities, its people, less so its military infrastructure, much more so his civilian infrastructure. So he launched what was said to be his counterattack just here recently with probably over 500 drones and 20 missiles, again, at cities. Ukraine's defenses valiantly repelled nearly all of that, had very minimal impact. But this was supposedly his big response. What say you regarding our friend President Putin?
Well, the reality is he still has enough long-range, bombers left that he can still do significant damage. Obviously, the challenge for Ukraine is to get enough missiles and anti-missile defense systems so they can repel the Russian attacks. I think the frustration that most of us in the West have is that both the United States and NATO are basically giving Ukraine enough, supplies to defend themselves, but in all practical purposes, tying one hand behind their back. I mean, they're making it very difficult to go in and take out these long-range bombers and their missile supplies, et cetera, as they've been starting to do here in the last few weeks. So, until the United States and NATO in particular steps up and actually gives them the weapons they need to fight this fight, basically the best they can do is limit the amount of damage that is happening inside Ukraine. And most of it, unfortunately, is civilian damage because the Russians are not discriminating between what is civilian and military targets. They're basically propagating a war of terror. They're trying to terrorize the citizens of Ukraine. They're trying to terrorize the citizens of Europe and scare the rest of the world into, letting this happen, which is really a tragedy.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's such a contrast when you see the daily video coming out of Ukrainian apartment buildings that have been hit, and playgrounds, hospitals, civilian targets. By contrast, you see new video coming out of this surprise attack on military installations, right, on bombers, on planes. The contrast couldn't be clearer for the world to see who's targeting what, who's acting with moral fiber in this war.
Yeah, I mean, look, the reality is there's no moral equivalency to the way the Ukrainians are acting versus the Russians. The Russians have kidnapped Ukrainian children. They're bombing Ukrainian civilian installations, hospitals, schools, apartment buildings, et cetera, where the Ukrainians have been very diligent in attempting to basically bomb military objectives only, military bases, infrastructure, with minimal civilian casualties. So, obviously in war, there's going to be damage on both sides with regards to the civilian civilization and the residents. But what the Russians have done has already been determined to be a war crime by many international institutes. And I think it's just going to go further. I mean, they really don't care. I think Putin's Russians are here trying to basically rebuild their Soviet empire. They have no qualms about violating international law. And the only thing they will ultimately understand is kind of Reagan's old adage of peace through strength. And as of today, neither President Trump nor NATO has been willing to step up and do the things necessary to put Russia back in its place.
Yeah, that's right. And my hope is that as these peace talks have broken down and the realities of Putin's war machine and aggression become clearer, maybe that will stiffen the spine of America and Europe to do even more. And continuing with the headlines, we are hearing rumors of a major Russian offensive. Today, there's projections that there's 50,000 troops that have amassed in a new region to push the offensive in a different way, maybe than Russia has done before. So these are rumors as of the recording time today, and maybe by the time folks are listening to this, that offensive has started. Do you think we will see anything new? Is this really just a lot of bluster from the Russians, or could they actually begin a major incursion in a new front that opens and changes this war?
Oh, I think clearly the Russians are going to attempt to, create a new incursion and attack different areas. They're willing to lose tens of thousands of Russian soldiers and now mercenaries from all over the world, as they've shown us. Now, the problem for them is, although they've been slow in their supplying equipment, the Ukrainians have the new Leopard tanks that over the last few days have very effectively blown apart Russian tanks that have been coming in convoys, where one tank has taken on 4, 6, or 8, Russian tanks at one time and has won those skirmishes. The Ukrainian military has been training for a defensive move. Many of these people who are being sent in by the Russians, again, are untrained mercenaries. They have no idea of the topography they're dealing with. They're going in and getting killed by the thousands on the Russian side. So it's really a sad situation with regards to the deaths that are happening. The only good news is it's the bad guys who are suffering most of the deaths at this time. But the Russians clearly are trying to do what they can to see how much they can gain before they're forced into some form of negotiations. And I think that's their overall strategy.
I hope that is the case, that we see if there's any kind of new summer offensive, that it's just more of the meat grinder assaults that we've come to know from the Russians. There are ideas that maybe they've learned something from the changes in drone technology, that there might be something new up their sleeve, but I do have my doubts. Let's turn our attention to our European friends and the fact that there is a lot more they can do. They continue to be somewhat hypocritical. On one hand, they say they're with Ukraine and they are arming and doing more than maybe they ever have before, and also rearming themselves. But they're continuing to do that with one hand, and the other hand, trade with Russia and buy Russian energy, whether it's direct or indirect, coming from the shadow fleet that the Russians use to transport their oil. Don't they need to have a serious final wake-up call before these steps go farther and come into the Baltics and come further into Central Europe?
Absolutely. I mean, look, we just heard 2 days ago here that the Japanese, one of our best allies, bought tons of oil through one of their black shipping areas.
Yeah, the shadow fleet.
Yeah, the shadow fleet, and they're taking advantage of the shadow fleet. The Europeans are basically funding most of Russia's budget now is coming from the shadow fleet purchases as well as direct purchases by Europe. So until Europe basically steps up and says, A, let's stop funding Europe by buying their oil, and B, starts actually providing weapons and monies to buy the weapons they need so that they can go on the offensive, Ukraine is going to be in a very tough situation. I mean, they literally have one hand tied behind the back. You listen to the press releases from the European countries and NATO, it's very impressive. They're committing, billions of dollars, but those are all commitments. They're not real boots on the ground, dollars on the ground, military on the ground, or equipment on the ground. They're, again, just sending enough to basically allow the Ukrainians to survive. And as you mentioned, this is going to have a major effect on the Baltics. It's going to have a major effect on Poland, who's emerging as the strongest, Eastern European country at this stage of the game. Finland and Sweden are preparing on their own to fight Russia if they have to, because of, where St. Petersburg will come in and the border along the Finnish front. So this is a very dangerous situation for all those that are right on the Eastern Front. And, where the Russians are rattling their sabers the most is, in and around Kaliningrad, which affects, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. It goes into the Swedish and Finnish impact it would have on the Baltic Sea. These are very real problems that, will push us closer and closer to a potential World War III if we don't get this under control.
Right. When is that final wake-up call going to happen for our European friends and allies? I feel like they keep hitting the snooze alarm, and they're waiting for that final opportunity to hit the snooze, and they need to get up. They need to wake up. Is it going to take more little green men showing up in the Baltics, in Romania, in Moldova? What's it going to take for that to happen? We're seeing headlines from, I believe it was the German intelligence services that said,
right,
yes, the Russians intend to move forward again with this little green men strategy that we saw work in Crimea in 2014, and it's probably going to be the Baltics. And that's personal for you, right? You have Lithuanian roots.
Yeah, my family's from Lithuania, but like Estonia is the one on the front line here. I mean, the country's divided at a riverfront, where on one side of the river, you've got the Russians pushing propaganda out across the river with signs and music and even radio broadcasts with respects to appealing to the Russian-speaking population. You've got Latvia, as an example, has probably the largest percentage of Russian-speaking and ethnically Russian people who were basically shipped in there after World War II as the Russians tried to, depopulize the Baltic states from their native countries. And so they brought in a bunch of Russians. And so it's a very real situation. And then obviously Belarus is sitting there on the Lithuanian-Polish border. So, you're talking about, literally hundreds of yards apart, you've got major militaries just waiting for something to happen. But I think, to get back to your question, look, part of this is, I think, where President Trump is coming from. There's a great frustration that the Europeans are not doing their fair share. They keep promising to do their fair share. They're increasing it, incrementally, little by little. But they're still counting on the United States to be the big gorilla, the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and to take the brunt of any potential attack. I think that's the frustration that President Trump is having. I think that's the frustration many in the United States are having. And I've done several, shows and interviews with folks in Eastern Europe, and I keep telling them what they don't understand is that the Americans, when they're willing to help and they want to be helpful, but we borrow money to do that. We're not sitting on a surplus in this country. These are taxpayers' dollars that we're willing to commit to our children and grandchildren for the sake of world peace. So it's not like we're making an insignificant commitment to try to attempt to support Ukraine and to help NATO. But if we're going to do that, it is a fair expectation for the Europeans to stand up and do their fair share. And their fair share isn't rhetorical. It has to be real. It has to be real dollars, real military supplies, permission and the ability for these guys to use longer range, missiles and the ability to reach into the different corners of Russia to take out the military industrial complex that is currently fueling this war. And the Russians they have shown us that they are willing to do anything it takes to win. The idea of them kidnapping tens of thousands of children, anybody who is a parent or a grandparent, can just feel the pain of all these Ukrainians. They'll never see their children again. The odds of them finding even a portion of them is going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible to accomplish. I mean, I can't think of a more heinous war crime than what Putin has, done there. Forget even, the killing of civilians and everything else he's doing. He's taking away the lives of, tens of thousands of children that will never know their families or their homeland. So, I mean, this is a very serious threat. And, we're blessed to be in a country that is surrounded by oceans. Most of us have never seen what war means. We'll never, feel the pain as those who fought in Pearl Harbor and World War II went in, or even Vietnam, let alone Korea. So for a large perspective, Americans are pretty isolated. And so, we look at it as something that's pretty far away. And I think President Trump, again, is frustrated with the lack of activity from the Russian side, from the European side. I mean, he's clearly bending over backwards to give Putin a way to get out. He keeps going, sidestepping, taking him on head on, because I think he wants to come up with a peace deal if he can make it. But I don't think he's going to be willing to surrender. I don't think he's going to be willing to give up Europe. And at some stage, the Russians are going to be, are going to push President Trump just a bit too far. And when they do, I think you're going to see a pretty strong reaction from President Trump and the Americans.
Right. So, Saul, what I hear you saying is, President Trump's really trying to represent the American people who want to see that the Europeans want this as much as we do, that
Absolutely.
They do want to invest in this Western world order, which we have secured for the last 8 decades, for the most part.
Yeah.
And they want to see that same commitment from our European allies. Is that about right?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I mean, they have had the advantage of living and taking advantage of a peace dividend that has been paid for by the Americans. And I think that, what President Trump has basically said is enough is enough. And I think that if you look at the public opinion polls for American voters, I mean, they're supportive of Ukraine. They're supportive of a strong NATO. They want a transatlantic partnership, but they also want them to pay their fair share. And again, we borrow money to help the rest of the world. I mean, we are subsidizing countries all over the world and trying to make it a better place for people to live. But this is coming from our blood, sweat, and tears. These are, monies that our children and grandchildren are going to have to pay back. And again, we're prepared to do that, but we're not prepared to be abused or used. And I think that's really the position we're in today.
Right. For our regular listeners, they've heard me talk about the Ruski Mir, this Russian world ideology, quite often. But for the new listeners and viewers, we want to explain that Ukraine is just a first step in this Russian ideology. It is a world that is Russian without borders.
Right.
Just like the Islamicists, believed that, the caliphate had no borders. It is the same concept. It has no end. Russia going into Ukraine, first Crimea was a first step. Then it's, Ukraine. Then it's the Baltics. Where does it end? It doesn't end from an ideological standpoint.
No, I think that's absolutely true. And I think that there is this false belief of some kind of Soviet empire coming back under a different flag and a different name. I think that the kleptocracy that takes place in Russia amongst the Russian leadership is such that war is good for them. Unfortunately, there are too many people that get to take advantage of what's going on with regards to the war. And Putin and his cronies are living high off the hog while most of Russians, there was just an article yesterday talking about how few schools actually have bathrooms for their kids, let alone school supplies. How few, hospitals have the necessary medical supplies in basically non-war zones, in traditional war zones, in traditional living areas for the Russians. So the Russian country as a whole, outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg, is not living very well. And, I find it ironic because I do have some friends who are, working in Russia and have relationships with the Russians, and they try to justify what's happening because of, the Orange Revolution, and somehow it's America's fault. And I keep saying, look, we're not the ones who cross the border. If Russia wants to live in a kleptocracy and steal from its own people, most of the world would just sit there and, in a very sad eyes, let them do it because there's nothing we can do. Similar to how we let China do what China does to its people internally. We may raise the issues. We may try to educate people. We may try to, fight for change, through a diplomatic perspective. But what the Russians are doing here is that, they're being extremely greedy, extremely arrogant. And they believe that the West, the United States in particular, isn't going to do a whole lot. And they're pushing that envelope as far as they can. And I go back. I think if the only way this is going to work and be fixed is kind of under Reagan's peace through strength perspective. Mm-hmm. And we have to wait until President Trump feels that he has no other alternative. And I think that time is coming.
Right. Saul, let me go back to your family roots in Lithuania, and just maybe you could share a little bit personally. Do you still have family that's there? Did they come over much further back in history?
No,
did they suffer under Soviet occupation?
Yeah, They my mother and father were married there. My sister was born in Lithuania. My other sister was born in Germany during the war, and my brother and I were born here in the United States. I actually didn't learn to speak English till I was about 7 years old because we lived in an ethnic community in the city of Detroit. And in Detroit, we had 5 Lithuanian churches, and Lithuania is a very Roman Catholic country next to Poland, the second most Catholic country in Europe. And so, it was our culture was all built around the church and the Lithuanian culture growing up. And so, my experience has been very real. I visited Lithuania like 32 times between 1989 and 1991 during the revolution when they basically declared their independence. And we brought over several delegations from Hillsdale College, actually, to help the first two governments of Lithuania talk about Western civilization, Western culture, how laws are made. We actually had the first two cabinets come over to Hillsdale College and meet with professors and students and talk about, how does a free country develop? And ultimately, we actually, Hillsdale College funded, and we brought over a bunch of books and research for the Free Market Institute in Lithuania, which still lives and thrives today. So, Michigan had a pretty tight connection, and my engagement in Michigan and many others. We kind of took our friends at, Hillsdale through the Republican Party, through conservative different networks, and did what we could to kind of help, the country get its independence. And now we watch with fear of, the next generation maybe being under the same kinds of, ruthless Russian aggression that could send many of them to the new Siberias of Russia if they were to invade these places, which I'm very fearful will happen to the Ukrainians if that happens.
Yeah, it sounds like it is very real for the Anuzis family to understand the realities of this. How difficult was it for you, I guess you said 7 years old, to go from only knowing Lithuanian to were you just in Detroit public schools and having to figure it out as you went?
Well, like kindergarten was in the Detroit public schools, and then we went to a Catholic school for first grade. And I kind of got lucky because my second grade teacher actually lived 2 doors down from me. And so she watched us play in the streets and knew that there's a Lithuanian community, and her son happened to obviously be English and speak English. And so, through television and the realities, we learned enough to kind of get by. But it was like when you had to sit down and start learning to read and write and do math and actually have more than conversational English, so to speak. It was a difficult task, but we made it. I think as most kids, you go through first grade, second grade, you get it, and you catch on pretty fast, and you start integrating with the other kids around the neighborhoods. But I think it was more of a challenge for my parents than it was for me. I mean, my mother ended up never driving because she had a hard time learning the language, and, worked her way through a factory in Detroit. And my dad, spent 32 years at the Fisher Body auto plant in Detroit. And so we found our American dream kind of as, labor Democrats growing up in Detroit, that ran away from communism. And so I think our appreciation is just a little bit different as we watch what's happening in Ukraine. Even though I haven't personally experienced it from a negative perspective, two of my uncles were partisans, both of them killed during the Russian occupation. I had an aunt that was, tortured because she actually had a blood disease, so she couldn't get out and go through Germany. So they sent her back to Lithuania, and the Russians thought she was a spy. And, she basically, died as an invalid because they tortured her virtually to death. And, a lot of the family that left there lived a very tough life until independence. And, some have done better, some have done worse, but it's a very real thing that you feel when you see what happens to your family, what happened to your family, how they react. And my fear is that, we're that next generation that, had the luxury of our parents, fought through the toughest parts. And we've never had to feel it other than feel the stories and hear about our, what our aunts and uncles and folks did. But that's a challenge for us here in America now. We've lived a pretty good life, and the rest of the world's still fighting some pretty tough fights out.
Yeah, those are the realities of Russian occupation, the Soviet times, and the truths that people experienced and the horrors still echo today. Is that something you've been able to share with your children? I feel like I've met your son before in Washington circles. Have they had a chance to go to Lithuania and visit themselves?
They have, actually. Two of my boys are going back in a couple of weeks. One of their friends is getting married there, and she happens to be Lithuanian. Her husband's an American, but they decided to do their wedding in Vilnius, which is going to be pretty neat. So they'll be back there in a couple of weeks. I had the unique opportunity. My parents and grandparents, righteous amongst the nations. And for those who may not know that, righteous amongst the nations are basically Gentiles who helped Jews during World War II. And so, they were honored by Israel for doing that. And that gave me also kind of a different attachment, because I met some of the people who, my parents, I actually went to Israel with Mike Huckabee on one of his trips, and the governor at the time took us over to the Yad Vashem, which is the museum where they basically honor the righteous amongst the nations. And they found a son of a survivor that my parents had saved, who was now a surgeon in Haifa. And they introduced the two of us. And then we laid a wreath at the eternal flame there at the museum. So very emotional time for both of us. At the time we were both in our mid 50s and in tears, thinking that, he wouldn't have been there if it wasn't for my parents, and I wouldn't have been there, and nor would he have been there, let alone Israel, if people like my parents hadn't stepped up. So we've had a chance to connect in a unique way. I've tried to get involved wherever I can to be helpful and to, I've known all the former Lithuanian ambassadors and try to, meet with them and introduce them politically to folks that I knew through my political involvement and stuff. And I have 4 sons, and all 4 of the sons have had a chance to go to Lithuania at one time or the other. And so it is something that you try to, preserve from a cultural standpoint as well.
Yeah, that is powerful. And it's so important to connect with the next generation. That's part of all of our jobs. And this story of what's happening in Ukraine, you can see where it impacts so many. I liken it to what's happened in the Middle East and how the world has followed what's happened there. This is just north of there, at the crossroads of so much more, and it impacts all of Europe and Asia's policy with how China's getting involved. This story has so many layers, and I think people could see that through what you just shared. I did want to end on one more sobering note. If you could comment on current negotiations. We saw that the Russians came to the table with the Ukrainians, and they provided their version of a peace proposal, which they admitted was just an ultimatum.
Exactly.
And ultimately was not a serious proposal in the least. I guess you followed this story. Any thoughts on this latest Russian ultimatum?
Well, that's exactly what it is. I mean, the Russians themselves said this is nothing more than an ultimatum that we know you aren't going to be able to accept. And so they're just kind of dragging out this peace process to take advantage of it militarily and politically to the best of their advantage. I think we just have to be very practical that, Russia is only going to stop if it has to stop. If it thinks it can get away with what it's going to try to get away with in Ukraine, it will try the Baltic states, it will try Poland, it will try Finland, it will come up with excuses in Romania and elsewhere, through the Balkans. And so the Russian mindset, especially those who are around Putin, is that Russia ought to be a great nation. And in their mind, a great nation does not mean Russia proper. It means whatever they can get their hands on, whatever they can steal, whatever they can take advantage of. They've lost probably close to 1 million able-bodied males in this idiotic war of theirs for no good reason, and probably half as many in Ukraine. That will never start families, that will never get engaged in society as a whole. And it's really a sad case. And so I think we have to become, as Americans in particular, we have to be very realistic. We have to pay attention to what's happening over there, because it's not going to stop by, it's not going to stop if people aren't, actually engaging in the political discord that is necessary to raise the awareness of Americans.
All right. Well, as we close out, Saul Anuzis of the International Institute, if there was one thing that you really want to leave our viewers and listeners with, that you just kick yourself if you didn't remember to share, what might that be as we close out today?
I think that we all have to be aware that it does matter what happens in Ukraine. It does matter what happens around the world. We are free because Americans have been willing to stand up and fight for freedom around the world. Not everybody has the luxury that we have to live in a country country that is surrounded by two oceans and fight the fight the way we can do it remotely. And to be a world leader means we have to have some form of responsibility to do that. And I think we as American citizens, we as Americans involved in politics, need to be cognizant of what's happening around the world and not be afraid to express our opinions to people in power, people in leadership, and to our friends and neighbors who help create kind of this ground-swelling support that allows us to do what we have to do in Ukraine.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Saul, for being here. Appreciate you, your work, your voice in all of this. And if you are new to us today, please like and subscribe. Peace and Power Ukraine. And we will see you next time for another great conversation, friends.